Welcome back to the Acceptance Project podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bryan Gross. And today, I want to take you to a moment in time that genuinely shifted the culture. That time was July 8th, 1955, and that's the day that rock and roll was born. If you talk to people who lived through that era, they will tell you how suddenly the soundscape changed. You could walk past a diner and hear Chuck Berry's Maybelline rattling the windows, or maybe sit in the back seat of a car and hear Little Richard's Tutti Frutti blasting from the radio with a kind of energy that felt new and a little unruly. Some people loved it. Teenagers talked about it the way kids today talk about discovering a band that feels like they understands them. Others were genuinely frightened by it. Parents wrote letters, now not emails, to local newspapers and radio stations in the mid 1950s. They worried the music would make their kids rebellious or disrespectful. Pastors preached sermons about the dangers of unruly rhythms that caused teenagers to dance in ungodly ways. Radio stations even held meetings to decide whether they should even play the songs. But the music kept spreading. It wasn't asking for permission, and it wasn't waiting for approval. It carried itself as if it had already decided it wasn't going anywhere, so you might as well learn the beat. And eventually, people did. Some embraced it, some protested it, and some tried to shut it down. But rock and roll outlasted all of them. Several years later, those early recordings still show up in movie soundtracks, gym playlists, and even on the speakers at sports arenas. And here's the interesting part. Today's episode is not really about rock and roll. It's about courage, voice, and what happens when someone decides to stop blending in and start sounding like themselves. But before we go any further, let's try something simple. Turn on a rock and roll song you really enjoy. Maybe it's Elvis singing Hound Dog, or Fleetwood Mac's Go Your Own Way, or maybe it's Queen's Don't Stop Me Now. Turn it up. Move around your living room or dance right there in your car. There's something healing about letting your body remember that life is not supposed to be lived stiff and silent. And after you catch your breath from all that ungodly gyrating around, let's talk about the song that changed everything. Now, while I was researching this episode, I found a story that made me stop and think. It reminded me how often creativity begins in places we would never choose. In 1951, a group of musicians was driving to a recording session in Memphis. They had their equipment tied to the roof of the car because, well, that was the cheapest way to travel. At some point during the drive, one of the amplifiers slipped off and hit the pavement. When they picked it up, the speaker cone was torn. They didn't have money for repairs, so they stuffed wadded paper inside the cabinet to keep the pieces from rattling. Now, when guitarist Willie Kizert plugged in, the amp produced a gritty, distorted sound. Not a pleasant distortion, a raw one, something that sounded like the speaker was fighting for its life. But when the band started playing, the tone added a kind of edge that no one had heard before. Talk about a happy little mistake. The song they recorded was Rocket 88. Many historians consider it one of the first true rock and roll records. Now, I love the honesty of that story. One of the most recognizable sounds in music did not come from a design team or a marketing strategy. It came from an accident, a broken amplifier, a moment that should have ruined the session. Now that makes me think how often we assume that when something in our life seems to break, the story's over. Maybe a relationship ends, a dream stalls, anxiety shows up, grief knocks us sideways, someone's criticism makes us shrink. We hide the broken places. We try to patch them quietly. We hope no one notices. But what if the broken place is the beginning of something unexpected? What if the thing we wish had never happened becomes the thing that gives our voice its character? That amplifier reminds me that imperfections are not always obstacles. Sometimes they're invitations. Sometimes the very thing we wish we could erase becomes the reason someone else listens to our story. That amplifier didn't make history in spite of the damage. In many ways, it made history because of it. Healing does not erase our scars. It teaches us how to sing through them. Now, rock and roll challenged the status quo because it refused to sound familiar. Before it arrived, popular music followed predictable patterns. Songs were tidy, arrangements were polite, Then suddenly, here came artists who sang louder, played faster, moved differently, and refused to shrink themselves to fit anyone else's expectations. People were uncomfortable. Change usually is. But history keeps showing us the same pattern. Movements begin with one person who decides to stop waiting for permission. I've seen it in classrooms. A teacher notices a quiet student and chooses to sit beside them instead of ignoring them. I've seen it in families. A parent chooses compassion instead of criticism, and the entire tone of the household shifts. I've even seen it in workplaces. One employee speaks up when everyone else stays silent, and suddenly the room feels braver. Chuck Berry did not ask whether his guitar style was acceptable. Little Richard did not check whether his voice fit the mold. They walked into the room as themselves. The qualities critics mocked became the qualities that changed music forever. Life works in the same way. The traits people question in you today may be the traits someone else desperately needs tomorrow. Your gentleness, your compassion, your hope, maybe even your willingness to include others. Courage lasts, criticism evaporates. Now, let me ask you something real. Where in your life are you still playing it safe? Maybe you've been sitting on a business idea for years. You have a notebook full of sketches or plans, but you keep telling yourself you'll start when life slows down. Maybe there's a book inside you. You've written paragraphs in the Notes app on your phone, but you never call yourself a writer. Maybe you've been thinking about going back to school. Even pull up the application from time to time, but before you can hit submit, that little voice starts asking you if you've waited too long. There may be someone you've been meaning to say I love you to, or an apology you've been putting off because the words never seem to come. It could be that the hardest person to forgive has been yourself. Or perhaps you've spent so long shrinking that you started believing the lie that your voice no longer matters. Here's the truth: the world has plenty of copies. It needs an original. Not a louder version of someone else, not a muted version of yourself. Every life carries a story worth telling. Every person has experiences, compassion, and resilience that no one else can offer in quite the same way. Somewhere, another human being is waiting to hear the words that only you can speak. Chances are, you'll never know when that moment comes or whose life it touches, but never underestimate what a little courage can set into motion. There's an idea I've been thinking about for years, one that has become the foundation for much of the work I do. I call it the psychology of shrinking. It didn't begin with the research study or a textbook. It began by paying attention to people. Now, when I say people are shrinking, I don't mean they're literally getting smaller or disappearing. This isn't a magic show where someone suddenly vanishes into thin air. I'm talking about something much quieter and honestly, much more heartbreaking. It's the person who used to raise their hand in class but doesn't anymore. The employee who once shared ideas in meetings but now sits silently in the corner. The friend who slowly stops accepting invitations, or the neighbor who used to wave every morning but now rarely comes outside. They're still there. They haven't disappeared physically. They've simply begun fading into the background of their own lives. I've seen it happen after bullying. I've seen it happen after a painful divorce. The loss of a loved one, relentless criticism, rejection, anxiety, and disappointment. Sometimes it happens because someone has been made to feel they don't belong. Other times it happens so gradually that even the person shrinking doesn't realize it's happening. One day they stop speaking up. They stop taking chances, and eventually, well, they begin wondering if anyone would even notice if they weren't there. That's what I mean by shrinking. It's the slow process of becoming smaller than the person you were created to be. The more I noticed that pattern, the more I realized we may have been looking in the wrong direction. Most conversations about bullying focus almost entirely on the person causing the harm. We study the bully, we try to understand the bully, we talk about how to stop the bully. Those conversations matter, but they often cause us to overlook the person who's quietly paying the price. So I've started asking different questions. Who stopped raising their hand? Who no longer joins the conversation? Who always seems to eat lunch alone? Who slips into a meeting hoping no one notices they're there? Who used to laugh freely but now barely says a word? Those are the people who have my attention. One thing I've learned is that shrinking rarely happens overnight. It's usually so gradual that it's easy to miss. Confidence fades one small moment at a time until someone who once felt seen slowly begins to believe they're invisible. That's why I believe kindness begins with observation. We can't encourage people we never really notice. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer another person is simply letting them know they've been seen. And once we notice them, we have an opportunity to become a source of light. People don't always need a speech or the perfect advice. More often, they need someone to pull up a chair, offer a smile, make a phone call, or ask a simple question like, I've noticed you haven't seemed like yourself lately. How are you doing? It's amazing how one sincere question can interrupt loneliness. There's one more piece to this. Sometimes we have to lend people our voice until they find their own again. Every one of us has lived through seasons when confidence grew quiet. I know I have. Chances are you have too. Somewhere along the way, someone believed in us before we believed in ourselves. Someone reminded us of our value when we'd forgotten it. And someone refused to let us disappear into the background. That's acceptance in action. Not simply believing every person matters, but helping them remember that they do matter. The more I've studied this idea, the more convinced I've become that people don't stop shrinking because we criticize them less. They stop shrinking because someone notices them, believes in them, and even reminds them they still belong. We help people grow again through louder compassion, deeper connection, and the simple decision to notice someone who might otherwise go unseen. As I think about everything we've talked about today, I keep coming back to one simple idea. Maybe the greatest lesson rock and roll taught us is that the world has never changed because everyone agreed. It changed because someone was willing to play the first note. Someone was willing to sound different. Someone believed there was room for a new voice, even when others tried to silence it. I think that's still true today. The next revolution probably won't begin with an electric guitar. It will begin in a classroom when one student decides to sit beside someone who's been eating lunch alone. It will begin in a workplace when someone notices the coworker who has quietly stopped speaking up. It may even begin in a neighborhood, a church, a family, or a community when one person chooses compassion over indifference and inclusion over exclusion. That's the work of Bridging Success. Our mission has never been about giving speeches. It's about helping schools, organizations, businesses, and communities create places where people don't just exist, they belong. We believe every one of us has the ability to notice when someone is beginning to shrink and the power to help them find their way back. You don't need a degree in psychology to do that. You don't need a title, a position, or even permission. You simply need to care enough to notice and brave enough to act. Imagine what could happen if every classroom had students looking for the person who's quietly fading into the background. Imagine workplaces where employees measured success not only by productivity, but by how well they cared for one another. And imagine neighborhoods where people knew their neighbors well enough to recognize when someone was struggling. Imagine communities where kindness becomes contagious. That's the future we're working toward at Bridging Success. Because every time we help someone discover their voice, every time we remind another person they belong, or every time we refuse to let someone disappear into the shadows unnoticed, we change more than one life. We change the culture around them. The world doesn't need more bystanders. It needs more bridge builders. And the beautiful thing is, every one of us has everything we need to become one. So if you, your school, or your organization is ready to become a bridge builder, then let's talk. Reach out to me at brian@bridgingsuccess.com or visit the website at bridgingsuccess.com and let's talk about how we may work together to strengthen your organization, decrease absences, or boost test scores because people are coming out of the shadows and feeling empowered. And if you know someone who has been shrinking, share this episode with them. A single reminder can help someone breathe again. And just remember, the amplifier that helped shape rock and roll was broken. Yet, from that brokenness came a sound the world had never heard. Maybe the cracked and imperfect parts of your life are not signs that you are finished. Maybe they are tuning you for a song only you can create. Turn up the volume on kindness. Dance to your own rhythm. Let your voice be heard. Someone out there is waiting for the music only you can make. So, until next time, take care of yourself and take care of the people around you. The Acceptance Project podcast is a production of Bridging Success, LLC. To learn more about the podcast and our work, please visit bridgingsuccess.com. This podcast and its contents are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. I'm Dr. Bryan Gross, but I'm not a licensed therapist. The topics and opinions shared by me and any guests are our own and should not replace professional or medical advice. If you're seeking mental health support, medical guidance, or help with personal matters, please reach out to a licensed professional who can provide the individual support you need.